Let me start by thanking Jeff Baskin and the Laman Library and the board and the staff for the generous support that has allowed me to continue to write about race relations in Arkansas. To be perfectly candid, if my reputation as a writer were derived from efforts to document a new sighting of the ivory-billed woodpecker, I sincerely doubt the Laman Library would be using its resources to help make possible the book I'm working on now. Not that there's anything wrong with the ivory-billed woodpecker research, but to give you a sense of what is driving the research in this new book about the fire, I'm going to read from my introduction to Rule by Race, Black-White Relations in Arkansas, from Slavery to the Present, that was published by the University of Arkansas Press in 2008. We are ruled by race in Arkansas for almost 150 continuous years, interrupted in part and only briefly by the politics of Reconstruction. White Arkansans since territorial days used whatever means necessary to control and dominate black persons. Generation upon generation of white Arkansans, with some notable exceptions, chose slavery, murder, rape, torture, beatings, intimidation, fraud, theft, discrimination, harassment, and humiliation as the instruments of control and domination of black Arkansans. Beginning with slavery, white Arkansans justified this domination through their insistence that blacks were not only intellectually and emotionally undeserving of democracy and equality, but were inherently dangerous. This repeated justification of white supremacy was ultimately no more than a rationalization to excuse economic exploitation and continued domination. At the same time, white Arkansans insisted that their treatment of African Americans fell squarely within the most revered traditions of Southern paternalism and was absolutely necessary under the circumstances. It was not until the modern civil rights movement in the 1960s that this power began to be seriously curbed by the federal government and by black people themselves. Simultaneously with the arrival of farm mechanization and other technological innovations that made a large black labor force superfluous, some influential members of the white power structure recognized that the stability and growth of their communities in Arkansas were better served by a grudging and often token acceptance of the changes demanded by blacks in the law and imposed by the federal government. Despite the legacy of relentless white supremacy, at no point did black Arkansans remain passive in the teeth of such an onslaught. As we shall see, beginning with the slave era and continuing through the 1960s, black Arkansans attempted various strategies to carve out an existence that allowed them to live with dignity and autonomy. I'm going to stop there and get into the talk. But that kind of sets the stage, actually, for this book. The history of the Negro Boys Industrial School is no less than a template for how we whites have implemented white supremacy in Arkansas, especially in the area of educational resources. Before I talk specifically about the Negro Boys Industrial School, I think it's important for us to try to get our minds around just how massive and ongoing the theft of resources from black Arkansans has been. As one example, on the front page of the April 6, 1949 Arkansas Gazette, officials from the Arkansas Department of Education, A.B. Bonds and Ed McQuiston, revealed that the sum of $4,250,000 had been diverted in 1948 from black schools in Arkansas by local school boards. According to the online calculator of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the buying power of $4,250,000 in 1948 is equivalent to $38,475,373 in 2010. This was, of course, just for 1 year. whites stealing from black schools and other black institutions didn't begin in 1948, and it didn't end in 1948. Put things in perspective, though the story of the fire at Wrightsville is more sensational. We have no idea, for example, of how many black Arkansans died because of the refusal of white Arkansans to provide for the needed facilities, physicians, and treatment for black Arkansans who developed tuberculosis. Even when we got around to building a sanitarium for blacks at Alexander during the McRae administration in the 1920s, it never met the need. There was a waiting list from the time the McRae Sanitarium for African Americans opened in the 1920s until the time the state was sued in the 1960s to end segregation at the Boonville facility for whites. Like the fire at the Negro Boys Industrial School at Wrightsville on March 5, 1959 that burned to death 21 boys aged 13 to 17, the closer that we get to the subject of race, the more uncomfortable and defensive we all feel, and we back off and begin to slip into the passive voice and speak and write as if we have no personal involvement in the subject. The families and friends that lost children in this fire couldn't do that. No human being should have to view the charred and skeletal remains of children, and it would be in this frame of mind that L.C. Bates, the African-American publisher of the weekly Arkansas State Press, would decide not only to destroy the print his photographer had made at the incinerated dormitory, but the negative as well. In an editorial on March 20, 1959, entitled, "Is Segregation Worth This?" Bates would confide to his readers that the photograph of the remains of the victims was even, quote, too gruesome to be filed in the morgue, unquote. A reporter for the Arkansas Democrat wrote about that morning, quote, "As firemen sprayed water onto the ashes, the survivors were watching. The skeleton of a boy was uncovered. Look, there's one now," said one of the boys. 2 hours earlier, 21 of them had been flesh and blood human beings. Even if they could have somehow have blotted out the visual memory of that morning for the 48 survivors, there would be imprinted forever the sounds and smells of humans burning to death. 16-year-old survivor Arthur Ray Poole recalled that, quote, 4 or 5 boys would all try to get through the same window at once. They were all screaming at each other. At another window, 4 boys were hitting the window covering with a chair trying to get it off. Poole had been waked up by the smoke and asked the boy next to him if someone had lit the wood stove that provided the only heat in the room. Told that it had not been lit, Poole looked up and saw, quote, fire sweeping along the ceiling. I started yelling and ran over to a window to get out. Then I saw Charlie, the night sergeant. He was tearing down the window covering, so I got through that window. A newspaper reporter for the Gazette summarized what occurred at one of the funeral services. A mass burial in a common grave, but in individual caskets for 14 of these children took place at the segregated Haven of Rest Cemetery in Little Rock on Canis Road, March 10. A crowd of approximately 300 was gazing at the 14 coffins under a tent as they listened to Reverend Charles Walker of Little Rock read from the Bible, when the scream of a woman standing at the gravesite shattered the calm of the service. "Oh Lord, my baby," she moaned. With this cry, she ran toward the coffins under the tent and was immediately followed by other sobbing parents. Mothers crowded up to the caskets. An elderly woman clasped her hands and paced outside the tent. "Lord, I didn't have but one boy. He was only 14 years old. Oh Lord, you done burned him up." As she laid a white lily on each casket, another woman wailed, "Give one to all the babies." Standing by one of the caskets, a mother cried, "My son, I'm here. Your mama is here." She then fell to her knees. A reporter observed the behavior of Superintendent Lester Gaines. He sat motionless, staring at the coffins. An occasional sob jarred his body. "I wish it could have been me," Gaines said with tears in his eyes. "Those boys only wanted someone to love them, and God and I loved them something awful." For these believers, the deaths of their children were intimately bound with religious faith so real and personal that their spontaneous expressions of grief seemed like a conversation as much as screams and sobs that reflected grief and love and possibly guilt as well. The mothers of the 21 boys were not from the tiny Arkansas black middle class who had been able to learn in a world of white supremacy how to make a life for themselves in Arkansas as skilled craftsmen, teachers, lawyers, doctors, and small businessmen. The women who ran to the caskets were by and large women who worked for whites as maids, as cooks, dishwashers, babysitters, who picked and chopped cotton. The boys at the school, according to Superintendent Gaines, who spoke to the press that day, were mostly there for minor offenses. One boy, for example, had stolen a bicycle. Some were not even delinquents, but simply had no place to go. And we could talk about the fire and the history for hours, but we're not going to do that tonight. Tonight I'm going to simply give a very general overview of the fire and then zero in on a part of the early history of the Negro Boys Industrial School and bring it forward and hope tie in some Arkansas history you may not be aware of. And we'll have some time for questions, and if you want to ask about specific areas that I gloss over or ignore entirely for lack of time in this talk, I'll be happy to try to answer them. But what you should know is that my opinion right now is that is and maybe in the future that we may not ever have available to us the historical evidence to tell us, for example, what caused the fire. We can speculate about cover-ups all night long, but this book is still very much a work in progress. And anything I would speculate on now is liable to be totally different when this book comes out, and I don't have a timetable to finish it. I do want to acknowledge that Frank Lawrence, the brother of one of the victims, is in the audience. Frank, would you raise your hand, please? If it weren't for Frank bringing up the issues surrounding the fire, I doubt if we would be here tonight. At various points in the recent past, Frank has worked on a film documentary about the fire, and he's generously shared his research and interviews with me. Now, I've already written about the fire once, giving it 9 pages and ruled by race, but knowing that I wasn't doing it justice. When I first heard about the fire in 2008 from Frank Lawrence, I thought I was already finished with ruled by race, which is another way of admitting that I hadn't known about the fire. Certainly after the fire, there was a flurry of articles, not only locally, but throughout the country. But within a month and a half, the story of the fire had vanished from the headlines and would only resurface a year later when the grand jury came back and declined to indict anyone. It was also about the same time when Governor Faubus dedicated the new dormitory, replacing the one that burned. Now, Governor Faubus had to be furious when the grand jury, after a year of deliberating, came back with its results, because he had done his best to saddle Lester Gaines, African-American superintendent of the institution, with the blame for the deaths of the children and to have him indicted. There is clear evidence, in my view, that from the beginning, Governor Faubus did his best to direct attention away from the fact that he was starting on his 5th year in office and had done nothing through the legislature to correct the conditions in the dormitory that burned, or to increase the funding of the school that would have allowed Lester Gaines to hire an adequate number of employees. As other writers have documented, including Roy Reed, whose biography of Faubus was chosen as one of the year's notable books by the New York Times when it was published, Faubus, a tax-and-spend liberal in a conservative state, a man of enormous complexity, lied repeatedly when it suited him, and he also lied and or twisted the truth about incidents surrounding the fire. Within hours of the fire, which occurred about 4 in the morning on the 5th of March,